My name's Polly Curtis. I am the Chief Executive of the think tank Demos, and we're absolutely delighted to be here. Very much welcoming everyone who came at 8 o'clock and lost half an hour's sleep. You're heroes. Thank you for coming early. And to our panelists, who are the most brilliant range of speakers on how to create a better business world. Just to give a little bit of context before we kick off and I introduce the panelists, this Labour conference feels absolutely focused on this question of how we create growth in this country. It feels like the central question that the Labour Party needs to not only answer, but demonstrate if it wins the next election. But what we want to talk about today is what better growth would look like, what good growth looks like, what growth that is good for the environment, for communities, for people, and fair growth looks like. So that's what we've assembled this panel today for. We're hugely grateful to the Better Business Act, who are partnering with us on this event, and we're going to hear more about that later. But in order going along here, Mary Portas is co-chair of the Better Business Act, High Street guru and broadcaster. We have, I'm really embarrassed now because I don't know who you are.
That's quite right. Charlotte Nichols. I'm on the Business and Trade Committee.
I'm so sorry.
Right,
I'm so sorry. My briefing has failed, but I'm absolutely delighted you're here. Thank you so much for coming. Paul Lindley is philanthropist, campaigner, and founder of Ella's Kitchen, with a fantastic book coming out about raising the nation and good childhood. We've got Chris Turner, the campaign director of the Better Business Act. And last but by no means least, we have Sarah Jones, Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation. Just to say, we're really grateful for Sarah for making the time to come today, but we've got Sarah for half an hour. So she's on the end, so she can slide away at 9 o'clock. But to kick off, we are going to start with Mary, who's going to give us a keynote.
I'll be quick. We've only got half an hour. So 6 months ago, I was sitting at a table with 9 people who have the capacity to transform our collective future. There was professors, economists, CEOs, and academics, and all of them were experts in climate change and the changes that they believe we have to make. Now, between them, they've advised this government and others, the World Bank and the World Economic Forum. Now, I was meeting with them because Kevin MacLeod and Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall and I had just started filming a new TV series for Channel 4 called The Big Climate Fight. Follow me on Instagram and I'll tell you when it's on. It's a very, very important piece of work. And what we were doing really is looking at practical ways that government and business together can not just reduce, but eliminate carbon emissions, covering massive areas like housing and energy. So when we sat with this team, we wanted to start at the beginning and ask these highly skilled experts about the green economy and net zero. Is it really too expensive that we keep getting told? Can we ever reach net zero? And if we can, why aren't we? Why aren't we doing this? Now, of course, we all have this huge list of questions, and this was our big opportunity to really tap into the might of the collective knowledge at this table. And then Hugh went totally off script, because he does that sometimes. And he just looked at them all and he just said, how worried are you for the future? Tell us out of 10 just how concerned you are. And one by one they told us. And one by one, my heart just dropped even deeper. Because one person said 9 out of 10. Everyone else, 10. I panicked. I've got children. I'm hoping one day I'll have grandchildren. What would happen to them if they inherit, with all the combined wisdom that these people have said, the fearful future for our planet? And it stayed with me a really long time. Why I'm doing what I'm doing, and consistently doing what I'm doing. This lingering sense of hopelessness that we've left it too late. But, and here's the but, which we need. That began to shift and it began to lift, because through those months of filming and where I've been working these last few years with big businesses internationally, talking to them, advising them, some that were startups coming into the market, some really significant companies, all of them were putting green growth at the heart of their businesses, bringing it to life in really very innovative, very practical and commercial ways. And as I sat with them, I remembered something else that these experts told us around the table. We have the answers. We know what to do. We've had the answers for many, many years. This is the Climate Change Committee who have written the Carbon Zero Net Budget. You won't know this book. I've had to read it, believe it or not. But it's extraordinary and the answer's all there. And here's the bit that I love. They said this. They believe, as I do, that as many of the business that I also have met with, that this, our future and the opportunity that we have is the greatest opportunity we've ever been given as a society to do better and be better. Because the change ahead, it's not about contraction or limitation. It's about creation. It's about innovation and imagination. It's not about putting off net zero goals to supposedly help the economy back on its feet. A carbon neutral economy is the economy. I mean, just as Mark Carney said, this is the ex-governor of the Bank of England. We're not all just, coming from the business side. 4 years ago, this is today's economy. Because after the Industrial Revolution, the technological revolution, sorry, I should have been using the mic, but I think you can hear me, of the past century, we are now entering the third great era of change. When you start looking at it like that, you realise how we've fallen behind. Because there was a time in the UK, our first carbon budget back in 2008 under a Labour government, cross-party, and the world saluted us on our work and they followed us. But now we're losing ground, pulling back even, and we're subsidising many of the dinosaur businesses that got us into this mess. We need to once again become a country that's leading the way through business and our economy because it's the future. Very little parable that I use often by the great late writer David Foster Wallace. There's these two young little fish swimming through the water. And a big fish swims the other way and he nods at them and he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two little fish swim on for a bit, but eventually one little fish looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" Now, for a long time, the water we were all swimming in, and particularly my area of business in the fashion industry, and there's lots of mea culpa that we all have to do, we were unawares. We were unawares of this all-encompassing rise of consumerism and the pursuit of profit at any cost. And the lionising of the CEOs who created the big profits. Let's knight them. Let's make them sirs. And Derek sirs worked in many days out there. Who created this at the peril of our planet and of humanity. So we're all aware of the water. We're no longer swimming blindly. And more of us understand that the historic waves of extraction and the short-term goals and thinking aren't fit for the territory that we are now in. And we all understand as business leaders, not just for today, but the years of tomorrow, that we are custodians of responsible profit, but also the health of our communal soul. And that's why I am co-chair of the Better Business Act, because we're fighting to create a small but deeply important step in the right direction to help guide that transformation. A change in the law that would ensure a cleaner, greener, fairer future for all. Because despite what we're being told, the move towards net zero isn't an economic problem. It's going to require long-term investment. We know that. But it's going to deliver a huge long-term return. And it's an exciting chance for us all to thrive, environmentally, socially, and economically. The evidence proves it. B Corps have a faster annual growth turnover than any other SMEs. And let's look at the fact that SMEs, they make up 99% of the economy and businesses in this country. A faster annual growth they have in headcount, and they're more successful at securing equity finance. Net zero has the potential to create up to 725,000 jobs in the UK, according to the Climate Change Committee. And when you start to see those big juggernauts like Walmart, as well as future-facing giants like Apple, putting this at the centre of their strategies, loudly and proudly, you know that this is the future direction of travel. Now, more than 2,000 businesses have now signed up to the BBA. 60% of entrepreneurs believe that they have a duty to make their business sustainable. And nearly 80% of British people say, and voters, of course, say that business should have a legal responsibility to planet as well as profit. But listen, make no mistake, there's a battle ahead. We're seeing that. And the past few weeks have shown us that. On the one side, we've got the laggards, a Tory party who want to drag us backwards. They're dressing up short-term vote-grabbing tactics as long-term pragmatism. And the old businesses that are backing them, you can see it. These guys are making huge short-term profits at the expense of people's well-being and our future and our planet. So, on the one side, though, we have to know this. There is this rising consciousness. It's all in this room today. It's big. I felt it. I've seen it. I'm on the road speaking in here, Europe, globally, working with some of the oldest business institutions, and they're listening to this, waking up to this, wanting to make change happen. Divides that I once saw as insurmountable are collapsing, and common ground is being found rapidly. I mean, let's just take a look at what happened after our Prime Minister's recent and shameful pullback on climate commitments. The energy and the automotive sectors, manufacturers and finances united together with the environmentalists to push back. Once, this was an unimaginable alliance, because it's no longer the greenies in the corner dreaming. No, huge businesses are urging government to act decisively. Voices like the Ford UK chair, Lisa Brankin, who described the UK 2030 target as a vital catalyst and called for three things from our government: ambition, commitment and consistency, because that's what's lacking right now. And Labour must work with business to co-create it. You see, we don't just need each other, we are each other. The new future really relies entirely on what I call Christmas, and one that's coming together, business, politics, to co-create a social contract of connection, cooperation and ambition to build this future together. And here's the thing is there's no elders to guide us on this. We have never been in a situation like we're in. There's no map to follow, we only have a compass. And it needs to be a moral compass. All each one of us can do is follow our deepest consciousness. And I ask you to do that in humanity. Open up our hearts and not just our heads to this. This isn't about just our work as business people or politicians. It's about our calling. It's about our legacy. And each one of us asking, what is it we want to leave in the world behind us? I was in a talk in Zurich and I heard someone speak at the end of a talk last week, and he said, do you know, I was looking at stats that people have, and it's the most common regrets of people who are dying in hospices. The number one was, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life that society expected of me. And two, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Well, the opportunity before us now offers us a chance to ensure that none of us have regrets. We can be true to ourselves because we know the truth, and we know that this is the right thing to do, and be guided by what is right. And we also can have no regrets by not working too hard, because I've been working like a dog the last months on this, but it feels right. And making sure that the work that we do is meaningful and important. And that means all of us here have a choice to make. And the question we must ask ourselves with this, when we're on our deathbed, which side of history do we want to be? Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much for that. It was just fantastic and stirring, and a real call to arms for Labour as well. So, Sarah, do you want to respond? No, I think we can do panel.
Lovely.
Yes.
Thank you, and thanks very much to Demos for hosting, and thanks to Mary for what were incredibly inspiring words that I think we can all agree with and support. So I'm in a new position, which is the Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation. So I sit in Johnny Reynolds' team in the business team, and I sit in Ed Miliband's team in the net zero team, and that is for a purpose. That is a new position, and Keir wants to bring together the two parts of government, because we can't create net zero without making it all about good jobs, and we can't create the good jobs of the future without delivering net zero, and the two need to be linked hand in hand. I think the theme for this conference, the question that everybody keeps coming back to of what are we doing here, is if not them, then why us? That's the question we have to answer, right, at a conference. And I think in this space, there is more clear water between the two parties than in any other area, because ideologically, practically, pragmatically, we have a completely different perspective to the Conservatives. So we've had a 13-year period of lack of growth, lack of investment, lack of plans, lack of certainty. Rachel's been talking this morning about all of the plans that the Conservatives haven't updated for years, which means that decisions in terms of planning are left to the inspectorate, they're left to the courts, there's no overall structure, and we've had a period of government rejecting what other countries around the world are doing, which is trying to use net zero as this huge opportunity to bring good investment into their country. So I was yesterday with some Americans talking about IRA and the bills that Biden has passed that are bringing in literally billions of pounds of investment right now into America, and have created 100,000 jobs in areas where they need them. I was also yesterday with some private equity and venture capitalists who were talking about why they are putting their money in America, why they are looking to Europe. Europe has also responded in kind and is changing some of the state aid rules, doing some of the things they need to do to attract investment. And we have a government that ideologically doesn't agree with that approach. So Labour's approach will be very different, and it will be based around good jobs and lowering bills so that we can reach our targets but make it work for everybody. The underlying theme from Rachel Reeves, some of you will have heard her on the Today programme this morning, is that stability and certainty, and creating a plan for business that they understand and that they can engage with and that they can rely on and won't change. Mary talked about the change to the 2030 target on automotives. I've been talking to business. They are absolutely way beyond the automotive industry. They are saying, you know, how can we invest when we don't know what the climate is going to be? And a lot of this stuff is not rocket science. The new, if you think about the national grid, which we've been talking about a lot this weekend, for example, if you look at a map of where the national grid goes, it goes up to all of the kind of key industrial heartlands where we were creating carbon energy, and it doesn't go to all the places where we need to create the new renewable energy. So in a way, we need to look at all these things as we would our canals or our railways, and think about how we connect up the country for the modern world. And that is difficult and hard. And Rachel's been talking about having a big tender just for practical things like cabling, because the whole world is going to be trying to get cabling. So we have a plan, and it's very big and it's very ambitious. And the Green Prosperity Plan, £28 billion of investment a year, will go to every part of the country and will deliver the green energy that we need in the future. But the question is, how do we do that in a good way, and in a way that creates good business and good outcomes and good jobs for people? I think there are a number of ways. So if you look at the private equity business at the moment, private equity obviously has been criticised in the past for very short-term decisions, for using the tax system, using the tools that they have to kind of buy businesses and sell. Actually, if you look at private equity now, because of interest rates, because of what's interesting for them, they are looking at long-term investments. They are wanting to make investments in infrastructure. it's for government to set the rules and to set the strategy so that they can come in and invest in the ways that we want them to. I was talking to a investor yesterday, a massive $1 trillion investor, and they were saying, you know, people think that we love a free market. We don't. We want to be really clear about what a government wants to deliver. That certainty is what will make us come in and invest. So government having an industrial strategy, having a plan, having areas that they want to create jobs in, and having a system that business can understand will mean that those businesses will come in and do the things that we want them to do. If you look at what America's doing in terms of their Inflation Reduction Act and all the work that's going on there, they are connecting benefits with what they want to see developed. So they are working, I've met a lot of unions that are working in America that are looking at kind of terms and conditions and linking that with incentives for business to invest. So we need to be working with our trade unions to say, okay, we are going to spend this money up front, this £28 billion. And if you look at the National Wealth Fund, again, that Rachel was talking about over the weekend, for every pound that we invest, we want £3 to be invested by the private sector. We need to work with our trade unions to say, right, how is this going to work? How are we going to create the skills? How are we going to create the good quality jobs? How are we going to make this work? And because we have the leverage of that investment, we can make sure we're getting some kind of return, and we can make sure we're getting the quality that we want. If you look at how to do this thing well in terms of the public, again, Rachel was talking this morning about changing the planning rules. We're going to need all this investment, all this infrastructure, all this new renewable energy. We can't just dump that on communities and expect them to accept that, you know, whatever anybody says. We have to do this in a respectful and a correct way. And what she's saying is, let's make sure if we're putting a new energy resource in your area, you get cheap energy. Like that should be, you should get something back, and that's about kind of managing business and taking the public with you. And finally, I mean, a lot of businesses are doing brilliant things, want to do the right things, have purpose at the centre of what they're doing, and we need to make sure corporate governance works in a way that enables them to do that. So I think Mary was right. We are in this third era of change. We do need to think about the infrastructure and the renewables as the new challenge of the future. And Labour has a really clear, really detailed plan as to how we're going to do that. There are documents published that you can read about, whether it's the £3 billion for the steel industry, whether it's the Great British Energy, which is going to create local clean energy, publicly owned, whether it's our plans for the automotive sector, whether it's our plans to grow all the different sectors that we are going to be looking at part funding. This is a really ambitious plan. It's very different from what the government has to offer, and it's all about good jobs, good business, creating the future that we need, which we have to do, because if we don't, we know what the consequences will be. So let's use net zero as this opportunity, this real opportunity to be world leaders, to tackle climate change, but also to make sure our businesses are doing the right thing. They're making money. People have lower bills, which is at the heart of everything that we're talking about. We're secure. We're not relying on Putin and the like for our energy, and we really can thrive. You know, the theme of this conference is we want to give Britain its future back, and this is where we will get that done.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left with the Shadow Minister, so I'm going to ask a quick question. I'm going to take one question from the audience, but I'm going to ask for a very succinct question. So I'm going to ask my question, then I'm going to go to hands up, but a very succinct question. My question is around governance processes. So Better Business Act, which we're going to hear more about on this panel today, campaigns for changes in governance rules to kind of wire the good growth, good jobs and climate kind of concerns into business decision making. Is that something you're thinking about, interested in? Will you support it?
So we're looking at corporate governance, and we want to make sure businesses can have that kind of purpose-driven approach. So it's something that we are looking at, and it is something that we want to make sure we can deliver. It's not, we haven't signed up to the corporate governance reforms that we're suggesting. I have been reading all of the corporate governance laws, and it's very interesting, and we need to make sure businesses can do the right thing. And I meet so many businesses that want to and that do already, frankly. So I mean, we do need to look at this for sure.
Yeah. Do you want to come back on that quickly, Chris? I was thinking particularly around the challenge that businesses have that prevent them from being able to do this because the governance isn't in place.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, thank you, Sarah. I mean, it's great to hear the plans, and I was sort of thinking as you're talking about the relationship between what Mary was saying from the chair of Ford, saying the things that the business needs: ambition, consistency, and they're all coming through in that plan, which is fantastic. I think my reflection on what you're saying, and we have a coalition, as Mary said, of 2,000 businesses supporting the BBA, is that what we hear again and again from directors of businesses is that actually in many cases they feel constrained by what their responsibilities currently are in what you're reading there in section 172 of the Companies Act. So the way it's formed right now essentially says it is your responsibility as a director of business to essentially put your members, your shareholders, advance their interests. And actually in the case of many of the directors we work with, that's a real bind, because not only as Mary says, this is a heart thing. Not only do they want to be doing the right thing, contributing towards these kinds of plans, as when there's a government that has them, but also they know it's the right thing for their business. But they feel as if the current legislation and the current frameworks for corporate governance, and indeed, essentially stop them from doing that. And actually, there's also, as you know now, there's quite rightly a lot of regulation and reporting requirements coming through on particularly the climate side. And so those core directors' duties that require them to put shareholders above all else are increasingly attention, not just with what they want to be doing for their business, what they want to be doing for future generations and the planet, but also with these increasing reporting requirements. So directors are being sort of torn in all these different directions, and actually a simple alignment of that's kind of core, almost what Mary's saying, so kind of a social contract, but the understanding we all share of what the role of business is in our society and in delivering these huge objectives and meeting these huge challenges. You just need to tweak that, so that directors, their responsibility, their job description in law is fully aligned with where the government's plans are, with where they want to go, and with what good business looks like.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we need to look at corporate governance. That's true, and there are other teams that are kind of making those decisions, not me, but I will certainly, very interested to talk more about this and very interested to understand more and to see what the kind of arguments are, and very happy to keep talking about it.
So
One question from the third from the back, just here. Can you put your hand up and a mic's coming to you, please, sir?
Thanks, Mike. I'm not sure if that's on. Hi, I'm James Ashton. I run the Quota Companies Alliance. We represent mid-cap and small-cap listed companies. Very interested in what you had to say about investment and infrastructure, particularly in private equity. Where does public equity play in Labour's plans? I mean, these are companies that operate to a high level of transparency. They're also a perfect mechanism for distributing the wealth to retail investors, but also through the workforce as well. So could you talk a bit on that?
Yes, I mean, I forgive me, I was talking about private equity probably too much because I had a very interesting conversation with a whole group of venture capitalists and private equity companies. But of course, we're not being exclusive in that sense at all. And you're absolutely right. If you're publicly listed, you're a lot more visible and accountable. And of course, we want to see investment from all forms, and it's going to be, I think, a mix of energy types. It's a very complex thing we need to create, because if you are using renewables, as we know, when the sun shines and when the wind blows, when it doesn't, you need to have storage, you need to have backups, you need to have that kind of mix of nuclear and all of the rest. So I think we need investment, and we want to talk to everybody about how we can deliver that. And as I said, £1 from the state wants to be backed up by £3 from the private sector. So I mean, I think there are huge roles for everybody in this. If we really want to be the world leaders, we're going to have to use all the strength that we have as a country and pull every lever we possibly can.
going to say a huge thank you to the Shadow Minister now. And thank you very much. I wanted to turn now to Paul Lindley, founder of Ella's Kitchen, to give us a kind of reflection on what we've been hearing today.
Sure, thank you very much. I think I'm going to bring a different perspective. I was sort of thinking, how can I contribute to this? And I've got a perspective trying to stand a few steps back from the kind of weeds of the Better Business Act and its context of how it's in business. And I was on the way in, I was thinking, oh my God, I've been working in and around business for over 30 years. And what the question that I constantly ask myself with that experience is, what is the purpose of business? What's the purpose of having a strong economy? Do we know that before we start working out how to operate it? I've been an employee and an employer. I've been the photocopy boy and an entrepreneur of the year, and small business, large business, sole business, being a director, now as Chancellor of a university. So I see the skills coming into business. And out of all of that, my learning from this weird perspective is business doesn't actually exist, does it? It's a piece of paper that says with a share certificate. And what exists are the people that operate within business, and the decisions and the actions that they take are led by a humanness of how they perceive what they're doing, what they're producing, the product or service is going to improve the world, how they can make a sustainable return on that for their shareholders and for their salaries and bonuses, and improve the world. And so if you put it from that perspective, business should operate in no different way to individual human beings or families or communities work, because they are the same people. I don't know if Sarah was in business before, but many politicians were in business. We all in business vote, so we're involved in politics. We're all involved in the civic sector and everything. So human beings, dividing them into government and business and charities, etc., is false, I think. And it's amplified by the fact that we set rules around each of those different institutions that we create that help people make non-human decisions that aren't good for society or necessarily that individual working in those businesses. And my reflections were, the Better Business Act is one aspect to how we can improve things, but the metric of success of an economy isn't the metric of success of human beings in our societies, I don't think, because how it's set up, it drives short-term decisions. Companies was just a question now. They report on a quarterly basis. So the incentive for those executives who are bonused on quarterly or annual returns is to make decisions that affect that quarter. But as a human being, those executives care about the environment and the pensions and their children and the security of this country, long-term decisions. Yet there's nothing within the Companies Act or the way our infrastructure of businesses are set up to promote long-term decisions. I think the way capital is owned doesn't promote long-term benefits, prosperity for the whole of society. It's concentrated in fewer and fewer people. That's the whole monetarism idea from the 1980s onwards, that few people are the innovators, few people can make a lot of money, and that will trickle down. And it hasn't worked. So we've got to look at how, if we want businesses to operate like human beings operate, and how you operate in a family, you live in a family, you'd want wider wealth ownership. So things like what Labour are doing with the National Citizens Wealth Fund to invest in British businesses on our behalf as individuals is a good thing. And then the final thing that I've sort of observed from those 30 years is that our measure of value is not conducive to what we measure value as individuals and our families. If we talk about growth as this country growing its GDP, then we should be celebrating the fact that cigarette manufacturers sell more cigarettes to us because that's going to increase the GDP. Well, that is just totally wrong. We've got to set rules around that. Growth, if you go to a doctor and they tell you you've got to grow, that's not a good thing, clearly. So we've got to put the context of growth in what is good growth for business being this force for good to improve lives. Better services, better products, more productivity, a way of doing things. And we're not set up to do that. So one of those aspects the Better Business Act really addresses, and that is that a company should be responsible for more people beyond the primacy of its shareholders. You can't have healthy profits at the expense of unhealthy environments or unhealthy communities. The whole things are connected. So I guess rowing back to the observation I had this morning, and I was thinking, how can I bring a different perspective? My perspective is everything is connected, and we should start with human beings, and we should operate businesses that, just like we live our lives, over the long term, measuring the right things, and opening up the opportunity to creating prosperity for as many people as possible.
Thank you so much. Charlotte Nichols, MP for Warrington North and member of the Business and Trade Committee. And you have a kind of ringside seat on that committee, looking at what government could potentially do, can do to support these initiatives and different ways of business working. Does it happen? Can it happen? What do you think the potential is?
So it's been just over 2 years since the government disbanded the Industrial Strategy Council. And of course, we've seen the splitting up on Whitehall of what was formerly Bays into the sort of very neatly named DESNES and Business and Trade Committees. So there's now no one with overall ministerial responsibility for industrial strategy. We had Kemi Badenoch in front of the committee around a fortnight ago now. And there's been a number of things from written ministerial statements over the last sort of year saying that announcements were going to be forthcoming around industrial strategy. And she said in the committee in a very sort of thick of it kind of way that the announcement was there is no announcement and there is going to be nothing forthcoming. And this is really one of the key problems when we look at not just growth, but good growth in the UK. We have increasing sort of model towards this sort of outsourcing model and the gig economy. And when you speak to sectors, as I did, I was a trade union negotiator for a decade before coming into Parliament. When you speak to companies in cleaning, in security, in social care, in logistics, they're all quite happy to pay their workforce more and want to, but they know that on the contract model they're on, when it comes to the end of the year and they go to tender back with what is the ultimate employer, they just won't have that contract renewed. So you have various factors that are depressing wages in certain sectors and companies that are saying, look, we just really want a level playing field here. You have it in things. So when the national minimum wage was established, the Agricultural Wages Board remained, but you still have some of those sector level negotiations in things like the ceramics sector, for example. Now, and obviously that's quite clustered geographically around the Stoke area. But what it means is that every business in that area has a rate that is agreed by all the businesses, benchmark quite a long way above the national minimum wage. They can all choose to pay more if they want to, but they all agree that no one pays less. And that helps sustain wages and investment in a sector that is obviously very impacted by, things like dumping from China of ceramics in the UK, trade policy and all that kind of thing. One of the areas that, again, the government has really failed to grasp the nettle on because of that lack of industrial strategy is really being a facilitator for collaboration. So the committee went out to Sweden recently, got to see the fully zero carbon steel that they've got, including the mining of the minerals, by the way. I mean, we're talking all the way through the chain. And it's going to be commercially available next year at around 30 euros more for a car than traditional steel. Here in the UK, we're still arguing about whether we're going to be using electric arc furnaces or hydrogen for what is essentially step 5 of that process. We are being left behind. And one of the things that they have done in Sweden, and the reason they've been able to get there, is because of investment in things like nuclear, which creates heat as a byproduct from it, and they use that heat for the steel mills. So they're really bringing together all of these things. We've got all of this investment that's happening in things like data centers, which of course generate a load of heat, but that heat goes nowhere. You have sectors like hydrogen, where we've got hydrogen trains being made by Alstom, nearby my constituency. You've got hydrogen happening all over the place, but actually nothing's really happening in that sector because the government is expecting every part of the sector to take the risk for the whole sector in investment, because you have companies that are saying that they're got products that use hydrogen, but there's no hydrogen to go in it. Places that are saying, well, we store hydrogen, but we've got no hydrogen to store. Places that are saying, well, we generate hydrogen, but there's no hydrogen infrastructure yet. And there's no overarching strategy from government to enable this. And so alongside the things that we've been talking about today, particularly in terms of the sort of strategy around workforce, obviously dealing with things like the mental health crisis is of course going to help with things like productivity. Treating people better is not just a morally right thing to do, it is a business good too. But we do need to talk about how we can harness the role of government, not just in investment, but also as a facilitator to bring together different sectors to allow them to actually collaborate in a way that benefits everyone. We don't have that approach from government. They say they're ideologically against an industrial strategy. They say that it picks winners. But ultimately, I think it condemns all of us to losing, because there are all these opportunities that are being missed and squandered and leaving us unable to compete internationally.
Thank you so much. And I think that follows on beautifully the kind of appeal for humanity as a motivation to actually saying the government can and should have a role in coordinating better business, and leads very neatly to Lewis Johnston, who's Director of Policy ShareAction, which campaigns for responsible investors. So investors have a role in this as well. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing and what they can do to support this whole kind of ecosystem of change?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. So, first of all, ShareAction has been a long-standing supporter of the Better Business Act for quite some time now. And I think Paul made a really good point, which is that you have to, we want an economic model that serves the planet and its people. You have to look at that holistically, fully in the round. And so our perspective on this, our approach is to focus on the investment system and making sure that investors are taking long-term responsible decisions that are in the long-term best interests of the environment and society, and fully responsible for their impacts in that regard. Clearly, investors then have a clear role in shaping company behaviour, because both through how they allocate their capital, but then how they engage with the companies that they're invested in, has a critical impact on the behaviour of those companies. I think that's particularly the case for pension schemes. So in the UK, occupational pension schemes have £3 trillion assets under management. So that's obviously a really critical part of the financial landscape. And the reason why we're particularly focused on this is because this is where most people get their exposure to capital markets. And so I think pension schemes have a particular responsibility to serve the true long-term best interests of their beneficiaries, of pension savers. And at the moment, they're perhaps hamstrung from doing so, precisely because of the legal duties that are put on them, those fiduciary duties, which is the mirror of what Chris alluded to there with regards to the Companies Act and what that places on directors, where they have a duty to maximise financial return. And the way that is interpreted at the moment is still quite narrow and quite circumscribed. And pension trustees are often saying that this is seen as a real barrier. So what we want to see is a redefinition in the law of those fiduciary duties that takes account of the true holistic needs of pension savers. That, obviously it's vital that you have a good financial return. That's the primary purpose of a pension. But it's not much good if you're retiring into a society that's breaking down and an environment that's in crisis. And so the pension schemes need to fully take account of that. It's in some respects a mirror of the bolstered Section 172 that the Better Business Act are looking for. We see those as truly complementary reforms. And the aspects that we'd be looking for is that there are four kind of key elements to it. And first is to really emphasise that the duties of pension trustees is to look at the long-term consequences of their investments, the impact of those investments on the economy, communities, the environment, and the financial system as a whole. So looking at that truly systemically. ESG risks and opportunities, but not just limited to climate change. We've had some clarification such that pension trustees can take account of the financial impact of those risks on their investments, but that really needs to be clarified. And then the views of beneficiaries. So our research shows that 73% of people want financial institutions to consider environmental and social impacts alongside financial return. It's quite similar to the research that the Better Business Act has had. That's a clear mandate, and they need to be responsive to that. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I just wanted to close with a personal reflection as well, which is, I've got an 18-month-old son, and I think this comes to what Paul was saying about what we see as the purpose of business and finance in the world. And I really want to see it playing a positive role in addressing the challenges that we're all facing and creating a better future, and not exacerbating those challenges. And we have it in our power to set things up and enact some reforms such that that's the case. And I think that it's very much in line with Labour's missions, because those 5 missions, I think that the 2 key themes that came out of those for me, in addition to these reforms being able to address some of the practical objectives of those missions, I think the underlying themes are of an aspiration to true long-term decision making and being responsive to the desires and views of ordinary people. And I think that this is exactly what we're asking for with this reform of the duties of pension schemes and really transforming the investment system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chris Turner from the Better Business Act. We've been kind of circling around the campaign you're running a bit. Do you want to just to kind of take your moment to say what is the Better Business Act and how could it really drive forward the change?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and yes, I'll be relatively brief because you've all heard sort of little bits of the sort of meat of what we're proposing. But essentially, the Better Business Act, we're a business-led campaign. So 2,000 businesses, over 2,000 businesses behind the Act. Our view essentially is, as I was saying earlier to Sarah, there is a huge opportunity here for business, but there are also some really real challenges in existing corporate governance that are preventing every single business. So to meet the scale of challenges that we face, we need every single business to be on this path, to be a partner of government in tackling these challenges. And corporate governance is kind of getting in the way. And indeed, in many cases where the culture of business has evolved, the concept that we have of what good looks like in business, the sort of the kind of instinctive understanding we all have now that business needs to be more human, more connected to place, more conscious of long-term challenges, that is not reflected in corporate governance, which is really a sort of dinosaur now, and directors' duties as they're currently formulated is a sort of a bit of a fudge. The current Companies Act back in 2006, the current directors' duties was a kind of compromise which hasn't really worked particularly well. And so in the Better Business Act, what we're essentially campaigning on is 4 principles. We want to make sure that in section 172 of the Companies Act, for anyone who wants some bedtime reading, that's a section that deals with directors' duties. So it is in effect the job description of a company director. And so the first of our 4 principles is that within that section 172, we want to ensure that they are responsible for aligning the interests of their shareholders with wider society and the environment. So it's no one thing over and above the other, but it's the long-term interests aligned of all of those stakeholders, which I hope sounds like common sense. And certainly the business leaders we speak to feel that way. And the second of our principles is that we want to do this by empowering directors. So that's the point I've been coming back to about the fact that this is not, it's not a sort of additional burden on directors. What it is actually is a reflection of what their responsibilities in the real world are in corporate governance. A third of our principles is that we want this to be the default. So in changing 172 of the Companies Act, this would apply to every UK director of a UK business. And we believe that's absolutely necessary because of the kind of challenges that we're facing in terms of, yes, we've talked a lot about climate, but also we know about some of the social challenges we're facing, inequality and opportunity. So to meet that kind of scale of challenges, and also it's important to say, to ensure that every single business can be a partner for government, particularly if you've got a government like an incoming Labour government would be, which is focused around big missions which place people and the environment at the very heart of what government is trying to achieve. So in order to achieve those missions, in order to tackle these huge fundamental challenges, we really do need every business to be a willing, able partner in those endeavours. So our third principle is that every business needs to be part of this. And then our fourth and final principle is a little bit more a harder nut to crack, but it essentially says that for the bigger businesses, and so as we heard earlier on from Mary, that's the sort of the 1%. These responsibilities would need to be reflected in reporting. So there needs to be some accountability here for big businesses, that when essentially they're making these decisions, aligning the interests of stakeholders, they need to be essentially telling us how that's happening. We're pretty confident from our relationships with business that the vast majority of SMEs, that's how they make decisions anyway. It's very natural for a business leader who can look around a room and see everybody they employ, and they can look out the window and they can see the town where they're based. It's very natural and instinctive to base their decisions on the interests of those stakeholders who are right in front of them. But we do know, as businesses grow, as we bring in more complex ownership structures, for example, public companies, it's much harder to maintain those links with people and place and planet. And so we need that reporting in place for those bigger businesses. So that's a little flavour of what we're proposing and why we feel it's so important right now for all of us, for what we're trying to achieve. But I would argue even more so and more excitingly for a government that's coming in and trying to achieve a broader set of big missions with that view to longer term progress.
Thank you so much. I'm keen to bring in some questions from the audience. So the gentleman at the front here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps not just a question, but a report on what's happening on the floor there.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Columnist Anderson. I'm the chair of Labour Business, which is the business membership group affiliated to the party. So we have a delegate over there, and we have a motion before conference to require the incoming Labour government to introduce legislation along the lines of what Chris has just described, not in specific terms, because motions don't usually get down to legislative drafting, but in principle to say that directors, through legislative amendment, probably to section 172, must have regard to people and planet as well as profit in all decisions that they make. Now, I'm talking a little bit out of turn. We haven't had discussions with Johnny Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary. We have a new member of the team who's obviously not today in a position to give a definitive view. I can say that through the National Policy Forum, where we also have a delegate who's in this room, Liz Hine, we've been trying to get an amendment to the report that goes to conference on this same issue. And it does refer to the need for reform of corporate governance, better corporate governance, but it doesn't commit to legislation. Our view, and we've been looking at this for years, and hats off to BBA because you've really given it the priority it deserves, because it's been a bit of a nerdy topic for lawyers like me until recently, and Mary Portas too, who's just tied it into the environmental challenge. We feel strongly that it's not enough to have an opt-in. Corporations, B Corps already have the ability to opt in, and that's great, but we've got to have a legislative requirement in our view, otherwise it's not going to happen. It's a bit like all women shortlists in the Labour Party. Women in Parliament, that wasn't going to happen without a legal obligation to have all women shortlists. It's the same with corporate governance. This change won't happen without legislation. So all I can tell you is that we're going to push that motion as far as we can. It'll go through conference. I think goodness knows what will happen to the text at the end of that, or whether it will get passed. But whether it's passed or not, we as Labour Business will be working with Chris, working, I hope, with colleagues across the board to make sure that it's in the manifesto. I can't give you any promises. I think there's some hesitation still. Corporate governance is definitely on the agenda. It's definitely on the radar. But whether we'll get legislative change remains to be seen. But we will work with you to see if we can achieve that in the next Labour government, and that will be a day one legislative change that doesn't cost any money.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I thought you were going to tell us what all the music was about.
Oh,
so
sorry,
that was very relevant. That's very interesting. So thank you. I saw another hand go up at the back. If we take one more.
Hello. Just still almost the point of information on the question, but with one of my clients, I've been working on, there's a statutory instrument going through the Lords next week on Tuesday, which is related relates to corporate governance in this, and it's come out of the crashes of the various businesses in 2016 to 19 and the white paper that's commissioned, which are that, which basically is obliging large businesses to, like $750 million turnover, 750 odd employees or more, so very large businesses, to formally report risks and analyse risks in the medium and long term, which affect publicly, which gives, and it's about the stability for the economy, the ecosystem around. Now, it's a conservative policy, but it's been supported by Labour as it goes through, and it's a good example of how, perhaps in the interim before full act can go through, it's ways of putting in. It's just be a way of kind of putting in the kind of things, or at least narrowing the tram line somewhat, to put some of these factors in about considering people, place, environment, as you're talking about. It's being presented next Tuesday, I think, in the Lords, so it's worth just having a look at that, maybe as a model.
Thank you very much. We're just going to take final contribution from the front here before we wrap up.
Thank you, everyone. Alex Wade here from Higginson. We've talked about creating a green economy today and Labour's role in doing that and making sure businesses behave responsibly. At the moment, I'm not seeing much detail from Labour on exactly how we're going to do that. And we work on things like key environmental legislation that basically tells businesses how to behave. So things like a deposit return scheme for drinks containers, things like extended producer responsibility for businesses. What is your sense across the panel about what detail Labour are going to set out and what should they be doing on the green economy? Because it's all very well saying we're on the green economy, but on key things like the DRS and stuff like that, we're not seeing much detail. So it'd be good to get your sense on that.
It's a really good note to end on. Unfortunately, Labour has left the panel with their busy schedules, but I wonder if each of us, one of the themes that has come through this conversation, which I have found absolutely fascinating, is how we get from really big concepts around, Mary talked about usness and about shifting a mindset around business. Paul talked about the need to put humanity into the kind of purpose of business. So we go from these really big concepts to actually some very technical solutions and technical ways of driving it forward. So I just kind of wonder whether, to sum up, each of our panelists could say where the balance needs to be between those things and what we would urge Labour to do now. Should we start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, I echo that kind of positivity, and I'm really pleased. And actually, what's come out of some of the discussion here today is big concepts, because these can be seen as quite niche technical changes, and we've got to situate that in the wider context. I mean, I think the kind of reform that we're looking for to fiduciary duty for investors, I too see it as common sense. It's a bit like the change to the Companies Act, and so what I'd like to see is Labour commit to enacting that. It's quite a simple thing, and it's about really empowering pension trustees to make the kinds of decisions that they want to, and make sure that they're no longer hamstrung in the way that they are often perceived to be. But it is part of a wider paradigm shift around what's the investment system for? What are we aiming towards? What's the purpose of it all? I think that has to be the aspiration: creating a financial system and an economic model that really serves everybody in our long-term interest. That has to be the key.
Thank you, Paul.
I think if my perspective before was about going out and looking from far away, if we go really in and see what politicians and what policy can do to change the business ecosystem, that's where I thought I'd come from. And if you think about it, politicians' job is to make priorities. There isn't unlimited of everything, therefore they've got to say, these are the priorities and this is what we'll do. And my advice to Labour, and what I'm delighted to see that they're following through a little bit, is if they're going for growth and good growth, what is that? And what are the steps that they can do to encourage prioritization of how that might happen? So to me, good growth is just, as in everyone's got access to participate in the growing economy, whether that's access to the jobs, to the management across all the diverse parts of our community, access to share ownership through employee ownership or pension funds, what pension funds can be spent. So justness, long-termness we've talked about, and a growing economy for all. And if you bring that down to, I think there's three things that a government could do. One is about priorities, have an industrial strategy. We're good at this stuff. We've got competitive advantages in this stuff. This stuff is important to the security of our country. We are going to invest. We're going to put public money to match private money to invest in these areas and get growth from that. Then you've got productivity gains and innovation, as I see it. Innovation, a government could really support entrepreneurs who imagine the future of things that don't exist just now and have got the wherewithal with the help of government to create them, to create better products and services than we have now, to create the growth from products and services that don't yet exist that we can consume and we can use. So how do they do that? How can pension funds invest in smaller businesses? How can some of the support for entrepreneurs kickstart more entrepreneurship and scale-ups, especially in a world where the bigger companies move their headquarters offshore and they pay tax in other places, and sort of how can we have a British set of businesses growing and staying in this country? And then productivity really relates to what a government can do is the connectedness of how business isn't separate from the rest of our ecosystem. So what the government can do with public health to help productivity for healthier employees and people in business is connected to business. And then the skills that come out of universities, come out of schools, how can the everyday economy, which I know Rachel Reeves has talked a lot about, of those jobs, that part of the economy, which isn't the sexy tech sort of high growth, but parts of our economy, but are the absolutely critical things that help look after our children and our older people through private business. How do we make sure that those skills are in this country, well paid, aspirational jobs that will help our country thrive? So, it's about priorities. There's a number there that they could target. And I'd ask them then finally to reflect on the fact that the word company comes from the Latin two words, cum and panis, which is with bread. It's about people sitting down and working things out together and going on journeys together to create a better world. And government can sit down with business, but in the end of they're all people, and we can create a better world through better products and services, and business being a force for good.
Thank you. Funny, Chris.
Yeah, well, Paul's comprehensive manifesto doesn't give me much room, but I think that the one sort of theme that has kind of bubbled away a little bit, and I just want to pull out at the end, is probably the theme of or the importance of innovation in the future that we're all kind of talking about here. That innovation was in my business days, that's what I sort of focused on. So I've got a particular interest, but I really think that kind of where the big, back to your question of, the big high level stuff, the missions we're talking about, the big challenge we all face, and then the kind of detail, I think a really interesting relationship between those two is in the innovation space. We know that lots of these challenges, and Charlotte was talking about it earlier on in the hydrogen space, for example, and what they're doing in Sweden. We need businesses to innovate. So actually, in many cases, I think in some of these challenges we face, the detail will have to come from business because it's stuff that hasn't been done before. It's stuff that we don't know how to do yet. And so I think there's a sort of being very, very clear, not just about those specific missions, but also more broadly about our shared understanding, as I said at the very beginning, of what we believe the role of business to be in our society. That, for me, it fixes what has become a fundamental break between people and business in such a way as you can actually link together missions and innovation coming through from business in a way that will chart the path towards the kind of achievements that we all need to see. So for me, there's the kind of changes that we're talking about, that Lewis is talking about. They build those bridges between the high level stuff and between the kind of innovation that we can't expect government to do, right? That will always be the role of business, but you're building the bridge so that it's all there. Essentially, it's all happening in the interests of all of us.
And what a brilliant note to end on. I think that's been the most fascinating conversation that has spanned from some really big call to arms about really a moral awakening for business. I think Mary's point about thinking about us rather than I is really stirring and important. I think Paul's points around putting humanity at the heart of the economy, and shifting those motivations is critical. And then how Sarah spoke about kind of the, I would say, emerging plan for growth from Labour. And Sarah talked particularly about the need for that industrial strategy. That, to me, along with Lewis's points around the role of investors, painted a picture of a partnership between government, business, investors, and that last point about companies, meaning with bread in Latin, about people as well. And that's kind of very much Demos's position. How do we put people into these partnerships and communities as well, so that all of these partners are coming together to create a better future and build growth together, and good growth. So I want to say a huge thank you to the panel, to Mary, and to you all for coming out this morning and having this really important and fascinating conversation.